I'm actually going to turn this over just to my colleague, Megan Friesen, right now. Megan is an occupational hygienist with OCAL. And over to you, Megan.
Thank you, Krista. I'm going to take a couple of minutes to provide some context on the Silica Control Tool. So the Silica Control Tool is the major project as selected by the Occupational Illness Prevention Steering Committee. This committee was assembled to look at and also to address occupational illness in Ontario as part of the Chief Prevention Officer's 5-year strategy entitled Prevention Works. So silica is commonly found throughout industry workplaces, especially in construction, where numerous silica-containing materials are often used. So in older buildings, it's present in the form of concrete masonry units, concrete and decorative finishes. In new buildings and new construction, it's likely to be present in the form of concrete, ceramic tiles, and in construction dust. Any electrical installations will likely require coring through concrete. Any plumbing repairs may involve grinding of concrete to allow for precision water line installation. Carpenters will need to secure wood framing to concrete walls. All of these activities, which are just a few examples, will put workers at risk of the inhalation of respirable crystalline silica. The burden of occupational cancer in Ontario is constantly evolving, and within a list of carcinogens identified by the Occupational Cancer Research Centre and also Cancer Care Ontario, crystalline silica is among the priority carcinogens. Silica is in the same grouping as asbestos and diesel engine exhaust. These carcinogens have the largest estimated impact on occupational cancer burden, and they also have the highest number of Ontario workers exposed. So it's estimated that over 140,000 Ontario workers are exposed to crystalline silica, which annually is estimated to cause about 200 lung cancer cases. So the Silica Control Tool was originally launched in 2017 in British Columbia by the BC Construction Safety Alliance. Another early adopter of the tool was the Alberta Road Builders and Heavy Construction Association in 2022. Followed by its success, a pilot project was funded by OCAL to bring this tool to Ontario in partnership with all of our occupational health and safety system partners, including IHSA. And just recently, WorkSafe New Brunswick has adopted the tool for use. So as of a year ago, workers and employers in Ontario were able to gain full access to the Silica Control Tool by creating an account. And the tool has also been fully customized to meet Ontario's health and safety regulations and is applicable as a best practice tool. So now allow me to introduce Dr. Melanie Gorman-Ng. She is the health and exposure scientist at the BC Construction Safety Alliance and an adjunct professor at UBC School of Population and Public Health. She holds a PhD in occupational and environmental medicine awarded by the University of Aberdeen. She is an occupational hygienist researcher with a focus on health hazards in the construction industry. Melanie developed the silica exposure database and the model that helps drives the Silica Control Tool. This is the online risk assessment tool widely used by the British Columbia construction industry. She also develops occupational hygiene resources for the construction industry, including exposure control plan guides, COVID-19 prevention guidance, and bulletins on topics ranging from isocyanate exposure to working safely during wildfire season. So I'll now turn it over to Melanie, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Yep. Thank you, Megan, and thanks everybody for having me today. I know I've spoken in the October webinar series and when it used to be an in-person event as well. I've spoken there about the Silica tool. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the tool and you know, I know in previous years I demonstrated it, etc. We've done that before, so I'm going to talk a bit. I'm going to follow up really on what Victoria was talking about the need for data. So I'm just going to oops, sorry. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So just bear with me for a sec. I need to, when we were practicing this beforehand, I had to share my entire screen so that the slides will show up. So, okay. Can everybody see my slide now, updating the Silica Control Tool?
It looks good. We can see it perfectly.
Okay, Great, thank you. Thanks, everybody. So that's what I'm going to talk about. We launched, as Megan said, we launched the tool in British Columbia in 2017. We started developing it in 2014, so it's been 10 years that I've been involved with this project. But since we launched in 2017, we've been collecting data continuously. So I just want to talk a little bit about why and what we do with that data. So as an overview of what I'm going to talk about today, first I am going to start, I said I wasn't going to talk a lot about the Silica tool, but I am going to give a brief background on just kind of how it works. Victoria did a good introduction with the figure from the paper in our previous presentation. So I'll do a little bit of background, talk about why we collect additional data, how do we collect data, what happens to the data that is shared, and then finally I'll talk about some upcoming tool updates. And just to back up, I work for an organization called the BC Construction Safety Alliance. We are a not-for-profit industry association with a mandate to develop health and safety resources for the construction industry. And I worked for them before I became an employee of the B.C.C.S.A. I worked indirectly for them through the University of British Columbia, and I joined the B.C.C.S.A. just basically to continue the development of the Silica control tool. I had already been working on the tool, and I joined to continue the development and also to do things like this, to talk about how the tool works, explain it to people, and just kind of oversee the scientific validity of it. The B.C.C.S.A. we hold the database. We have all the servers that run the tool, and then we do that on behalf of our partner organizations like OCAL and now New Brunswick. So we house all of the data and the servers for the tool, and then work with our partners. So we're a part of, and so when we make a new version of the tool, it rolls out to all of our partners and everybody gets access to the same database. So just wanted to kind of give a bit of background before I start. So respirable crystalline silica, as most of you know, silica is a very common naturally occurring mineral that is in many construction materials like concrete and asphalt and sand, brick, stone, etc. And when it is disturbed in some way through, crushing, grinding, drilling, sweeping, there's a dust that is created, and the respirable fraction of the dust, that is, the part that gets deep into the lungs, can cause lung scarring. I have this picture here of a lung with silicosis. It's an irreversible lung disease, and it can also cause lung cancer. And I just have here a picture of the crystalline structure of the silica. There are different structures that the silica molecule can take, and it's the crystalline form that is most common in these types of minerals that we see in construction, and that's the type that causes health effects, lung health effects. So the Silica control tool, what is it? As I'm sure many of you know, it is an online risk assessment tool that was originally created for the BC construction industry to help them to manage silica exposure at their work sites and to comply with the WorkSafe BC regulation. And it was developed by the B.C.C.S.A. in cooperation with WorkSafe BC and with the University of British Columbia School of Population and Public Health. The tool is basically, it's underpinned by a large database, and that database was used to create a linear regression model. I say here it's derived from over 5,000 personal silica measurements. And so the linear regression model, it predicts the level of exposure. So it can predict the exposure on a task-specific basis. So for individual construction tasks, the model can predict the exposure level, and it can also predict the effect of controls, engineered controls like local exhaust ventilation of wetting. So you can get an estimate of your uncontrolled exposure and then also an estimate of your controlled exposure. So to go a little bit deeper into how the model actually works, so we have about 5,000 measurements. We actually have a much larger database than that. We have about 13,000 measurements, I think. But, this also ties into what Victoria was saying earlier. A lot of those measurements don't meet the quality control criteria that we have for actually using in modeling. Like, for example, a lot of them are respirable dust measurements. We can't use those in our modeling. We only use data that actually has had some kind of chemical analysis to detect the crystalline silica. So once we apply those criteria, we end up with about 5,000 measurements, which is still a lot. And that is what we use to derive our predictive exposure model. So the things that the predictive factors that go into the model are the process. So that would be like just basically the work activity. So for example, cutting concrete with a power saw, that's one process. Drilling concrete with a hammer drill, that's another process. Milling asphalt is another process. So that is one of the variables. The use of engineered controls. So that's like wetting, local exhaust ventilation. And one thing that I want to clarify here is that because controls, the way that they work, they can affect different tasks differently. So we don't expect, wetting to have the same effect on every single task, or local exhaust ventilation to have the same effect on every single task. So we actually combine process and control together when we do the modeling. So we can really only estimate the effect. We can really only estimate controls when we have controlled data for that specific process. So any of you who have used the Silica tool, you might have seen that, we'd have local exhaust ventilation for some activities, but not for others. And that is really why, because usually it's not because we don't think it's a valid control or because we haven't thought of it. It's usually because we just don't have the data. The other variables that go into the modeling are the industry sector that the work is taking place in, the type of project it is, like if it's a new build, renovation, demolition. We also consider the work environment, like if they were indoors or outdoors or in a very restricted space with poor airflow. The region, so we have, our data represents a lot of the world. Actually, we have data from Europe, we have a lot of data from the United States, we have data from across Canada. So in Canada, we do it on a kind of provincial level. So every province would be a separate region within the tool. And the exposure duration is also considered. So the way that this works in the tool is, when you go in the tool, you enter details about your exposure scenario in a series of drop-down menus. And what that does is that populates the variables for running the model. So it tells the model, this is a new build and they are doing, they're drilling concrete and they're using local exhaust ventilation that's integrated to the tool, and they're working indoors. So when you go through the drop-down menus, it gives the model all that information, and then the model runs and estimates the exposure levels, ideally without controls, and with controls if we have enough data to do it. Sometimes we don't have any data without controls, so in that case we just present the controlled estimate. And then basically the tool gives you an exposure estimate, and what that is, it's the 95th percent upper confidence limit, because as I'm sure most of you know, when you have when you have a database and you do exposure estimates, there is uncertainty around your estimate. We do give you one number, but really what we know from the variability within the data is that the actual exposure could fall within a range. So we present the 95th percent upper confidence limit as a protective estimate of exposure. And then that is compared, the task-based exposure levels compared to the 8-hour exposure limit, just to kind of add a level of ALARA to the control. So we're encouraging people to control exposure as much as they can. So if we have so much data, why do we need more? And I put this picture because this is from another study that I did, where this worker we're doing 3 samples on this worker. Like this is a lot of data that we're collecting. Some of this data is going to go into the Silica tool, and some of it is actually a lead sample. And I like this picture just because it's like a large amount of data. So even though we have so much data, we do need more because we are always looking to add new activities to the tool. We hear from industry through the feedback in the tool that there are work activities that they're doing that they can't find in the tool, and they want help with that. Also, it's to add new control options for activities. So as I said before, we can only estimate the effect of a control when we have data for that control and work activity combination. So we also again hear from industry that they're using controls that are not available in the tool. So we're trying to get data to support that. Also to kind of improve and modernize the exposure estimates. One of the real strengths that we value about the Silica control tool is that it can move with the time. So if there are improvements in control technologies, the tool can reflect that. It's not kind of a static lookup table that tells you what you need to do. It can modernize and move with the times. The other reason why I like to add new samples is to reduce the confidence intervals around our estimates. So if we only have, like say 4 samples for a control and activity combination, the confidence intervals are going to be quite wide, and the tool would give a fairly conservative estimate of exposure. If we get more data, we can narrow that down a little bit and get more get estimates of exposure that are closer to what are actually happening in the field. So how do we collect data? So in BC, we run a sampling program where we work with local consultants and industry to come out to construction work sites and do sampling. So usually how this works is either the consultants will tell us, hey, I have a client who's doing sampling in construction. Do you guys want to partner up to get some of this data for the tool? And we say, yeah, great, that sounds fantastic. Usually if it's something that we're looking for, or employers will get in touch with us to tell us that something is missing in the tool, and we say, okay, great, we'll come and sample it. So we do task-based sampling to really target the activity of interest. We usually use the PPI sampling head, which we use the 8 liter per minute version of the PPI, and that is so that we can get a large volume of air in a short period of time to allow us to collect enough dust that it will be detectable by the analytical method. We do also sometimes use cyclones, like data from a cyclone is obviously acceptable because that is a standard method, but we don't usually use it for task-based sampling just because the limit of detection ends up being too high, and we often can't tell if the exposure level is below the exposure limit or below the action level. We also collect data through literature review. So, if we become aware of a new study that reports silica data, we review it and add it to the tool if we can. And we also accept volunteered data from industry. So people sometimes send us their sampling reports, and then we can add it to the tool if it meets our quality control criteria. So, I've talked a bit about the quality control criteria and the type of data we're looking for. So I want to give you a bit more information about what that means, like what type of data are we looking for. So I said before, we need data that uses a chemical and analytical method for detecting silica. So like, for example, NIOSH 7500, and it doesn't have to be NIOSH 7500. If it is a method that is acceptable to your regulatory agency for sampling silica, it's probably okay for us. We also look for data where occupational hygiene best practices were used. So we want to know that the person who did the sampling knew what they were doing. So did they use blanks? Did they do flow rate checking, that sort of thing? And often, I can verify this just through chatting with the person who has the data. Or reviewing whatever kind of report they have. We do need some information about the work activity, so we can't really classify it in our database and make it meaningful for modeling if we don't have any information about what the workers were doing. So we need a little bit of information about that, and that's again something I can work out with the person who is supplying the data. We need some information about the controls that were used. I mean, it doesn't need to be in great detail, but we do need to know generally what type of engineered controls were used. We accept full shift data. We accept task-based data. We don't require any company or personal information. So if you know of data that can be scrubbed of all of that kind of personally identifying information, I can accept it like that. Like a redacted report or a redacted database is acceptable. I'm pretty flexible about how I accept the data. I can work directly with anybody who has data to figure out the best way for you to get it to me. Like if you want me to send you an Excel spreadsheet that you can enter your data into anonymously, I can accept that. If you wanted to send me a report that you have, I can accept that too. It's, you know, I'm interested in getting as much good occupational hygiene data as I can into the tool. And then what happens to the data once we get it? So any kind of database or report that we get is stored on our B.C.C.S.A secure server. It can be password protected if desired. And then I enter the data into the Silica control tool database. And once it goes in there, all of the identifying information is, if we have it, is not entered into the database. Basically what we enter is what province was it in, what was the industry sector, what was the project type, and what work activity were they doing. So, you know, if it's the type of work where you're the only person in your province who does that type of work, somebody who got a hold of the database might be able to identify you. But otherwise, you know, if you're doing like concrete drilling, there really isn't any way that you would be identified in our database. And also we you know, the database is also on our B.C.C.S.A secure server. I don't share it with people. So that's just one of the things that I want to convey. You know, if we get a report from a company, we do not share that with, we don't, like in BC, we don't share it with WorkSafe BC. In other jurisdictions, we don't share it with any regulatory authority. We just keep it for ourselves and enter it anonymously into the database. For the data that we collect in Ontario, the anonymized version, like the version that is put into the Silica tool database, is shared. Oh, sorry, I put CARWA. I don't mean CARWA. I mean CWED. It's shared with the Canadian Workplace Exposure Database, which Victoria mentioned earlier. That is the database of exposure levels from Canada that is run by Dr. Hugh Davies. So we will share an anonymized version of the data with CWED. But if that is something that is a concern for you, you can just let me know. So finally, I've just completed an update of the model. So we get data all the time and we enter it into our database. And once we have enough data to justify doing a model update, I do that. And I really only do that when I think I'm going to have enough data to add some new activities or new controls. So I have a new version that I just developed. I sent it to our web developers. They're going to be putting it into the tool in, I think, 2 or 3 weeks, and then it will roll out to all of our partners. So in this new version, we've added some new activities, mechanical street sweeper. We've added a bunch of work activities for asphalt plants. We've added some activities for removal and demolition of ceramic tiles. And for 2 different work activities that are already in the tool, chipping concrete and bush hammering concrete, we've added a new control option, which is local exhaust ventilation on the tool. So that is everything that I had to share with you today. I'm going to be around for the whole webinar if anybody has any questions, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Melanie. If anyone has any questions now, you are welcome to unmute yourself or put them in the chat and I'll read them out. Oh, Kimberly has her hand raised. Go ahead, Kimberly.
Sorry, just a note. Thank you, Melanie, my partner in crime. I wanted to just mention that something interesting came up around what you were discussing with a client the other day, and I thought it was a good time, Krista, to sort of mention it. that, you know, we remained at arm's length to any ministry with this service, so that it would not be associated with enforcement in any way. And again, you've articulated that really well with the redacted data. But the one thing that came up was to associate the licenses with a construction companies in Ontario. The BC tool utilized the I'm going to get the name wrong, the account number. And we've utilized the WSAB account number, and it was asked actually in a ministry session and by clients, and it was somehow, are you associating that? You know, people were afraid, so I want to make it super clear with you on board here and explaining that though we remained arm's length from the ministry, the use of the account number as an identifier only, that you're in Ontario and that you're, you know, a construction company. We do not provide any data back to, I just wanted to make that super clear, back to any punitive nature in its entirety ever. And I wondered if you come across this at BC, if you wanted to address it, because you're talking about the data sharing. We clarified it the best we could, but we just, I mean, if you want to take that opportunity to do so as well, that would be great. So people know anything you do is just making the tool better. That's all we're all after. It's just making the tool better for you. That's what it's used for, period, I guess.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Thank you for that, Kimberly. I think that is a really important point. We don't share the data that we get, and we also, you know, if somebody goes into the Silica tool and makes an exposure control plan, we don't share that either. That just stays on our server. It's all arm's length, as you say. And I think that's part of the reason that's part of the reason why B.C.C.S.A took this on in British Columbia instead of WorkSafe BC, because we are that kind of arm's length organization. We have the partnerships with industry, but we're not a regulatory agency.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. Dr. Kevin Hedges from OCAL has his hand up.
Hi, Melanie. Nice to see you again. And thanks so much for your time. Just, I've been kind of following the development of this tool for some time now. It's really wonderful work. Just a point of clarification, and I noticed you mentioned the 95th, it's not the 95th percentile. You talked about the upper confidence limit with the 95% confidence. Has that changed? Did it used to be the 95th percentile and now it's the upper confidence limit with 95%?
No, it was always the upper confidence limit.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Okay,